Trump basically looked at the Constitution and looked at the US's ability to actually uphold the Constitution, legally uphold the Constitution, and went, all right, let's give it a go. Right, let's test these boundaries. Let's push them as far as we can possibly go. And by virtue of just breaking it all the time, breaking rules all of the time, I don't think that's controversial to say. He very quickly found out that the capacity for holding people to account was much lower than the capacity to break rules, basically. And I think that's basically what we're finding in this country as well, is like our capacity to hold our leaders to account is far exceeded by their capacity to do wrong.
So welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm here with Matt Hope, the editor of DeSmogUK, which is an environmental investigation website and a site producing some of the best investigative journalism surrounding Brexit and disaster capitalism probably in the UK.
Thanks, really appreciate it. Good to be here.
No problem. Right, before we start, I have to plug two things really fast. First of all, my book is now available to order. This is a slightly ruined copy because I have not treated it well, but you should totally go and buy it and treat it really beautifully and frame it and maybe even read it. And also, if you follow the link in the description below, you can get 35% off of ExpressVPN for 12 months. So, Matt, one of the big groups of think tanks or charities that I kind of focused on in my book, and you have focused on in some of your reporting, is Tufton Street. Like, do you want to explain to people like what the Tufton Street group is and sort of how it came about?
Sure. So Tufton Street is basically now a shorthand for a kind of group of broadly anti-regulation think tanks and campaign groups. The reason that we call it Tufton Street is because most of them were certainly initially based out of 55 Tufton Street, a specific office space. They now also have some offices next door in 57 Tufton Street, and they're all kind of clustered around this street in Westminster, just around the corner from the House of Parliament. So some pretty big names you might know. For example, Vote Leave were initially based there. The UK's main climate science denial campaign group, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, is based there. Taxpayers Alliance are based there. So these are all kind of think tanks which are particularly influential for a particular section of the Tory party, and they basically happen to be all based in this one space, essentially.
Yeah, it's quite disturbing. I'm just pulling up the list here of people who are there. So we got Brexit Central, Business for Britain were there until 2015. Leave Means Leave were there. The Global Warming Policy Foundation, Global Vision, European Foundation, Civitas, the New Culture Forum, and the Taxpayers Alliance. And next door, there's the Centre for Policy Studies and the Initiative for Free Trade. It's quite notable to have like such an ideologically similar set of think tanks all grouped together in the same building almost. I mean, like, what is do you want to like explain what the agenda is that they're kind of pushing forward before we go on to like how they influence the government?
So it is kind of odd to think of having all these organizations in one space, but that's only if you consider them to be really separate entities. So actually, the way I like to think of them more accurately, I would argue, is that they're actually basically the same entity, but just with lots of different wings, lots of different, essentially, front groups. They share a lot of the same board members. They share a lot of the same advisors. Sometimes they share staff. There's certainly a revolving door between the staff, and they certainly share an ideological agenda. So once you actually piece it all together and map it, like we have, and allow me to put my own plug in there. We did this big map a couple of years ago about the crossover between pro-Brexit groups and the kind of climate science deniers, and how they all essentially share people, share personnel, and share funders and share links. Once you actually kind of see all those connections, you start to realize that these aren't really, in any real sense, separate entities. And they're kind of just front groups for different bits. So you just mentioned a few of them there. For example, the Initiative for Free Trade. Well, that's great, because then whenever anything has been spoken about by future post-Brexit trade deals or anything to do with free trade, you roll out Dan Hannan's outfit, the IFT. When you're talking about climate change, great, roll out the Global Warming Policy Foundation. That's our wing that deals with that. And it's basically a way that they could get themselves in front of as much media as possible, in front of as many TV cameras as possible, and come across basically pitch themselves as experts on these very specific things, but actually they're just really kind of one big mass entity pushing a particular ideological agenda. And just to say quickly, then couple of words on what that ideological agenda, broadly speaking, is, and there are some nuances, but it's broadly anti-regulation. Right? It's broadly pro-deregulation. So they believe that the free market can basically solve basically all problems, and they don't like the interfering hand of government. And so basically any policy issue that you encounter that they talk about, the suggestion or the solution that they're pushing will generally be stripping back government involvement.
Now, these groups were almost unanimously in support of Brexit, and then after the vote happened, they were involved in pushing out like a number of sort of pro hard Brexit publications, pro sort of the World Trade Organization Brexit, the WTO Brexit, that would have quite potentially been catastrophic. We're still sort of seeing what the results of what we've done to date are. And it's kind of being, I think, muted a little bit by COVID. Like, people aren't sure what to attribute to that and what to Brexit. But a lot of these think tanks are actually set up as charities. So how is it possible that they can actually have an ideological bent to them? Like, I thought charities were just about helping people.
It's a very, very good question. And I think there's two elements to this. One is they can be set up as charities because the current law basically means that the Charity Commission is pretty toothless. It can't really do an awful lot. So it has slapped them on a wrist a few times. And for example, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, it now had to separate out. So it has actually two arms. It has the foundation and it has the Global Warming Policy Forum. Now, the forum is allowed to do the lobbying, and the foundation, in theory, does its education activities. From what we've found from looking quite closely at this organisation over the years, that there's very, very blurred lines between those two, but it's allowed it to have this official setup where the foundation's a charity and the forum isn't, so it allows it to carry on these activities. Others, such as the Institute of Economic Affairs, which actually isn't based in Tufton Street, but it's based just around the corner and is very much part of this kind of network through shared personnel and the revolving door personnel and funders, as well as its ideology, has been, slapped on the wrist by the Charity Commission a couple of times. It's kind of had, long conversations with them about whether or not its activities really are educational. It claims it's winning that battle because the Charity Commission had to withdraw a complaint, a ruling it made against it, but that was actually on a technicality, so that's not as straightforward as it seems either. But basically, it's muddy. It's because in this country, what counts as a lobbyist, what counts as a campaign group, and what counts as a charity is actually pretty hard to define because our laws and our regulations don't provide for that.
Why is that a bad thing?
It's a bad thing because, as you say, it allows charities, people who are taking charitable money and then therefore not having to, pay particular sort of taxes or declare particular interests in the same way. It's allowing them to basically push an agenda under the auspices of being a charitable organisation. So it's sort of overall it's bad for transparency, and it's also, you would argue, bad because charities. Most charities, lots of charities, do fantastic, valuable, socially, conscious work, and it kind of undercuts and devalues what it means to be a charity. So I think it's not unreasonable to expect a lobby group that is involved with having meetings with politicians regularly to push a particular agenda, for them to have to declare as a lobby group and not hide behind their charitable status.
So, okay, it's all very well and good. Like, you can say, yeah, okay, so maybe they have like a certain amount of backing. They've got like an ideological bent, but there's a lot of people sort of screaming lots of crazy things into the ether. Like that's pretty much Twitter, and that doesn't mean that they have any like. That doesn't mean that they are in any way powerful. Like, people can say anything they want. Like, well, mostly. Don't dare say there was election fraud. That'll get you banned. But like what makes you believe that they have some sort of power or influence and are not just sort of like throwing their money down a drain of research and wonky policy papers that no one really cares about?
So you're absolutely right to say that these people can say what they want. That's not the issue here. Like, we have no interest in curbing, freedom of speech and the right of organizations to have an ideology. Like that's fine. That's a legitimate thing, and in fact healthy in a democracy, that you have a bunch of groups with different ideologies kind of out there saying stuff and debating and arguing. The problem is that these have privileged access to a particular set of politicians that, for example, most charities or most people could never dream of. So this isn't just some crazy person on Twitter shouting. These are people who are having, one-on-one meetings with ministers, one-on-one meetings with ministers that are only sometimes recorded. DeSmog and others have revealed the fact that, sometimes these get logged as official meetings, but the problem is they then open themselves up to being FOI'd on the details of those meetings. So increasingly, they're meeting politicians in a personal capacity, as they put it, which means they don't have to keep a record in the same way that the public who elect these politicians could then get a hold of and scrutinise. So they have this privileged access to this particular set of politicians. So that's what gives them power. That's what gives them influence. And because the details of those meetings are largely hidden, it's very hard to know if they are performing, for example, their charitable function of educating, or if they're doing very close lobbying.
I mean, like the thing that I think that people don't quite realize is the revolving door between these kind of groups and government, essentially. Like for example, like Matthew Elliott, who was at the forefront of the Brexit campaign, was also the founder of the Taxpayers Alliance. Who I don't know how on earth they managed to get so many people on Question Time and on BBC programs, but they're set up to appear like a grassroots organization. And this is something that Peter Geoghegan from Open Democracy has written a lot about, and he wrote about in his book, actually that's probably behind me somewhere now that we mentioned it earlier, Dark Money, and essentially like it's trying to create this impression that there is these opinions that they're putting forward, whilst would probably be considered fringe, they're attempting to like drag them into the mainstream by pretending like there's like lots of grassroots organizations who are in support of them, like the Taxpayers Alliance. Like that sounds like a group that's totally on the side of the ordinary working person, and not like probably the furthest from the Taxpayers Alliance as you could possibly get. In that it's a whole bunch of groups who are funding it, like that don't necessarily who don't necessarily pay any tax in the UK. So like, what do we know about the funding of a lot of these groups in Tufton Street?
And so this is actually really the crux of the matter, is the reason all of this is a problem is we don't know very much about who funds them, right? So it's one thing to say that you have an ideology. It's one thing for me to go on to Twitter and have a personal opinion about something. It's a whole other thing if I'm being paid by someone who has a vested interest in that opinion to go and do that. And, take it the next step, or beyond Twitter, if I'm then putting myself at the front of an organization who's being paid by someone with vested interest in stuff we're saying, and I then appear on, Question Time, as you say, or appear on these mainstream media outlets, it's a real problem for democracy then, if you don't know where that money is coming from. And most of these groups are fantastically opaque about where their money comes from. Doesn't mean we don't know some of them. We have managed to uncover some of them through a lot of hard work. DeSmog, and you just mentioned it, Peter, Open Democracy, and others have done some really, really hard work to try and uncover these. But fundamentally, we don't really know. The types of places we do know they get money from, there's a couple. One is kind of major industrial business. So basically businesses that kind of have an interest in shutting out other European businesses and kind of creating their own little on our island monopoly for themselves. That's one. So Bamford being a kind of a good example of that. Another is hedge funds. So hedge funds, basically, because they can sway politics, they can sway policy decisions using these outlets, they can then bet on the outcomes of that. And so hedge funds kind of have a vested interest, and currency managers as well, have a vested interest in kind of trying to tweak the game and trying to, gain an edge. And the way they can kind of gain an edge and get some sort of insider influence on this means that they can basically make money off it. So those are kind of two key kind of sources of money we know they get. But the fundamental problem is that they aren't transparent. So when that person, when people from the, like say people from Civitas or others are meeting ministers and having these conversations, we don't actually know who they're representing. and that is a real problem for democracy.
I mean, like I kind of laid out in the book, like a bit like there's a very like quite obvious roadmap. Is like, okay, say you're like, I use the example is like, right, say you want to turn Essex into a car park, right? You've got to like amass some wealth, like through hard work or inheritance. Like you can find yourself like a think tank or charitable organization. You can call it like, I don't know, the Center for Radical Innovation. Then you got to like make a report on all the social and economic benefits of turning Essex into a car park. And then, you know, throw yourself a nice like charity event, hire some lobbyists, and maybe even like you can hire a relevant like MP or government minister, you know, at some sort of extravagant salary at a few hours a month in order to have their ear. And then it bypasses all of the usual channels for like making decisions that we would normally expect politicians to rely on. You know, instead of like talking to some constituents and, you know, phoning up some experts or listening to some testimony in Parliament, that they just sort of go straight to, you know, the IEA ball and look at the policy papers that they're producing. And it has this weird effect of like pulling the apparent like public conversation like way to the right in economic issues, at least anyway. And how effective do you think like this is? Would this like shift to the right have happened anyway, perhaps, or do you think that this like you can legitimately attribute like a lot of these sort of more extreme policy ideas as coming into the mainstream solely because of this network of think tanks?
They definitely have an influence, for sure. I mean, they wouldn't keep getting funded, they wouldn't keep working hard to do what they do if they weren't having some sort of influence on the pool. But I think it is important to acknowledge that, you know, a confluence of factors. So firstly, economic crisis happened. So it kind of broke open, you know, British politics to allow views that weren't kind of this centrist, kind of mainstream neoliberal kind of approach to suddenly get a voice, because people started questioning whether or not that was a legitimate approach to running the country, running the economy. So that kind of broke open the space. And then, of course, you had the Brexit debate, which again kind of hailed this new era of kind of, well, nonsense is one way to put it, polarization, misinformation, you know, media panic because no one really understood, media desperation to demonstrate what we would describe as false balance. And being an environmental journalist, I've, you know, been fantastically familiar with false balance for a very long time. You know, on climate change, you interview the climate scientist and the climate skeptic. Well, that's not balance, that's false balance. But there was some sort of desperation among the media hierarchy, the mainstream media hierarchy around Brexit to try and provide a similar thing on the Brexit debate, which didn't really represent the full spectrum of views. It just ended up being incredibly polarizing. And then you had politicians coming to the fore. You know, Boris hitched his wagon to Brexit. And, you know, there's been plenty better accounts written of whether or not he's a true Brexiter at heart, or if this was political opportunism. But whatever it was, he hitched his horse to that wagon, and he's now had to ride it. And so it created this space. So that's basically what happens. It created this space, this political space for these organizations. And then, of course, then there was kind of, once the referendum happened and we got the result to leave, there was a complete vacuum of expertise. So no one really had done sophisticated analysis of how we do Brexit. I don't think that's a secret. And I think blame is across the spectrum there for that fact, really. But nonetheless, there was this huge vacuum. And then where there's a vacuum, these groups, these kind of Tufton groups, that's their absolute dream. Because as you say, they can step in and say, I've got a policy paper for that. I've got working paper for that. We have some talking points. So don't worry, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, you can go stand in front of the camera and here are 5 talking points that we've already got prepared for you. Don't even worry about reading the research. Like, here you go. This is just what you say, right? And all of that stuff could have come from an industry-funded research paper, like you say, someone with deep, and if not industry-funded, then someone with deep pockets who presumably has an interest in them writing this stuff. So that's basically what happened. And so through this vacuum, they filled that vacuum and they continue to fill that vacuum. And as you say, there's a huge amount of crossover. So Number 10 immediately started hiring when Boris became Prime Minister, immediately started hiring from, you know, the Leave the former vote leave infrastructure. A bunch of people went in from there. A bunch of people went into Liz Truss's office from the vote leave infrastructure, from the Tufton Street infrastructure. So these people, having suddenly kind of been on this fringe, mainly providing talking points, mainly being talking heads on media programs, suddenly found themselves putting themselves into these offices of power essentially and having influence. So events kind of led to their influence, which led to more events, which has led to more influence, if that makes sense. And while politics is cyclical to a certain extent, I do think there's a counterfactual where that didn't happen, and where these groups didn't have their influence and didn't kind of perpetuate the current politics that we're experiencing.
The current is the former conservative Robert Halfon actually credited the Thatcher's success or even her initial election as being because of the think tanks. So they've definitely had some sort of influence on British politics. I mean, I guess the media are probably as complicit in giving them the platform to say what they want, but yeah, it's difficult to say. What would you say is the most obvious or egregious example of them essentially manufacturing consent, to steal a phrase from Noam Chomsky, manufacturing consent for these policies? What's what's their greatest success?
That's a very good question. I think one of the greatest successes was basically them reframing a trade deal with the EU that went along the lines of kind of what we had pre-Brexit as a bad thing. And the reason that they did that, and you mentioned it up top, pushing for these kind of WTO style or Canada Plus style deal or whatever it is, it goes back to their core ideology, which is anti-regulation. So the EU brought in a load of regulations, some of which are good, some of which aren't. You can have your own opinions on them, but it's basically a bureaucratic body that tried to standardize and in general improve certain standards. And these groups don't like that. They don't like that. They want the free market to sort it out themselves. And so when Brexit happened, it was a fantastic opportunity to essentially rip all that up. And they were, fairly transparent about this. They produced these policy papers that are basically saying this is a fantastic opportunity for us just to rip up the rulebook and start again. And if you rip up a rulebook, it's an awful lot quicker to write a shorter rulebook to replace it than it is to go through and replace it line by line, an awful lot easier. And then that basically gives the people we suspect are their funders, but certainly the people who share their ideology and the people who tend to fund the types of politicians, so big business, big industrial businesses, people who might suffer from things such as environmental regulations, it creates the space then for them to redraw the rules and kind of have a playing field that very much favors them.
How pervasive do you think this web of kind of influence is able to how pervasive do you think it is across the entire ruling class, especially essentially of Britain? Because I mean, right now it's very easy to feel this the basically free market neoliberalism as they sort of believe it is just that's just the top policy of both of the two major parties at the minute. Keir Starmer has managed to leapfrog Rishi Sunak in going in his drift to the right. I'm not sure exactly how that happened. They've got completely blinded there. Keir Starmer comes out, it's there will be no raise in corporation tax under Labour. We wouldn't do that. And then Rishi Sunak raised it 25%. You just sat there being wow, you just got played, son. So how pervasive do you think this web of influence is? Do you think it's exclusive to the one particular faction of the Conservative Party, or do you think it's got sort of tendrils across the whole political spectrum?
It's very pervasive. It's very pervasive in the ruling class, for sure, as you put it. I think the critical thing is that all of this takes money. So kind of sounds like an obvious thing to say, but all of this takes money. So the people it's going to have most influence with are those who are probably already ideologically bent to helping people who have money either keep or make more money. So I think that's where the ideological differences tend to come from. It's not necessarily that these people wouldn't, influence a Labour government, for example. If, as you say, if a Labour government came in with some sort of opening for them to have policies that they felt suited their interests, well, I'm absolutely certain they would work with those people as well. It's just that at the moment in the current policy we have, there's a particular large, powerful, they're in Downing Street section of the Conservative Party who are doing all this. So they're very much in bed with them, and that does tend to be that. Has tended to be the people and the politicians they've tended to be in with all the time, because they were always the most likely to deliver on their goals. And there is a certain sleeper element to this as well, which I think people sometimes forget. So some of these groups were a little bit of a joke for 5 or 6 years before, Brexit started to happen, and before they even kind of entered onto the table as a conversation, and before Cameron sort of started his lurch towards the right. They were kind of a little bit of a joke, but they remained funded. They were still out there. They kept their profiles up. They kept their kind of research base up. And that's because there was going to be a moment in history where they became useful. And that moment in history was the Brexit referendum, followed by Boris Johnson's government. And all of these people now who spent what isn't necessarily a huge amount of money to them on keeping these organizations alive for a decade where maybe they weren't having that much influence, are now seeing that being paid, 100-fold, having a return on their investment that we could only dream of, right? So I think there was also that element too. And again, that takes money. You do have to question whether the other side of the political spectrum or other sections of the political spectrum have the resources to essentially keep this kind of network alive for a bunch of years where it's not really paying off, whereas this side of the political spectrum clearly do.
Yeah, I mean, like, why don't the left just do this? Like, it's often like an argument that I see raised. It's like, the right are funding all these think tanks that they're like, the accusation is essentially that over the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years, I mean, you can go the whole way back to the Lewis Powell memorandum, but like, they have basically attempted to subsume the supply of information, essentially. So they went like straight into universities and tried to recruit like economics graduates like straight out of uni, and like build up their just like this web of like think tanks or like nonprofits, news outlets, like research groups, and that they've essentially like built this up over 30, 40 years. Like, well, why didn't the left do it as well? Like, where where were the sleazy left wingers who were creating their own think tanks?
So I think the first thing to say is, like, there is some of that. So let's not pretend there aren't, left wing think tanks. There are. They just tend to be smaller. They tend to be less well resourced, and I think that's the critical thing. This system, as I said before, it takes money. So the only people who are going to invest that money are people who can ultimately, serve in the long run. So it's unlikely that you're going to find people with a bunch of resources for what we might describe as, socially progressive policies or socially responsible policies that are going to stop people who already have money making more money, or would require them to lose some of that money, or, to put it another way, give some of that money back that they probably owe. So, that's fundamentally why is that, rich organizations, rich people, rich industries already have the resources to plow into this, and they're going to plow it into the side of the political spectrum that ultimately suits their aims. And you'd argue that often those aims don't match with the left. There is probably some sort of version of the world where that is true, but right now in the current politics we experience, they'd argue that's not the case. So it fundamentally comes down to resources, I think, and that's the fundamental thing here, is that it's not a fair fight, basically. So organizations like DeSmog, for example, which do a lot of corporate accountability work, which are charitably funded, philanthropically funded, but we're obviously not going to get a ton of money from big corporations. Like, that's fine. That's obviously not what's going to happen, because the work we do makes their lives a lot harder, because it's a democratic and social good. So we get other charitable money, but that's ultimately going to put a ceiling on the size of organization we can be, at least in the immediate term. Right. So that's basically, that's just an analogy, but just using something that's obviously very close to my heart. That's just an analogy that kind of shows the uneven fight here. Whereas if you look at an organization that could potentially help a fossil fuel company make a load of money in the future, that fossil fuel company, which has billions of dollars of revenue to spend on these things, will probably give them some cash. So so that's fundamentally why this isn't really a fair fight.
One of the other problems that Naomi Klein kind of raised in This Changes Everything, she was talking about the amount of green groups that are funded by the fossil fuel industry. Then it's like just another form of astroturfing, where like the groups who are causing the most damage are saying, look, we're funding green projects, and they're funding some toothless like campaign group that isn't going to challenge the people that that they're apparently setting it up to challenge. It's like if if like the Joker was secretly funding Batman, like it just wouldn't work, you know. It doesn't work, and that, like, I guess that's the point that you're really trying to make, is that like we the people do not have the power, finance, organization, or money, or ideological sort of cohesion to have this kind of influence on government policy, and on the public conversation, on how like the sort of mainstream narrative, or what's considered like the general view, can be like skewed so much by the influence of these groups. And like when people are trying to compete, we just can't. So like the question then becomes like, how do we stop this?
I mean, yeah, exactly. It's like you say, it's a question of resources and a question of access, right? So the other thing is, this particular government, these particular set of government ministers are kind of Teflon to scandal. So where, a meeting with a particular person or a meeting with a particular organization who has a vested interest may previously have been something that would have forced at least a conversation about resignation. Now it's just normal. So these groups, again, you asked me what their greatest victory was. Actually, maybe I'd change my answer, which is the normalization of this kind of politics, actually. So the fact that you can have these meetings, the fact that they can even kind of own up and be honest to a certain extent about the fact these things go on. But there's just so much other stuff going on, right? And the fact that it's just happening again and again and again. Like, you think about the number of things that have happened in this current government that historically, maybe not the last 5 years, but probably the last 20 years, would have forced a resignation, which haven't even really caused a ripple. The list is really, really long. And they've basically created the normal. They've created this normalization of this kind of politics where this is no longer scandalous. When as I've been arguing, it really should be scandalous. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's that. And to answer your question about what should be done, we need to tighten up the rules on what makes something a charity and what makes something not a charity, and actually give the regulators some power and some teeth there to really go after and pursue and remove charitable status where they decide that's not the case. So that's kind of a simple tweak that could be done, but for whatever reason, and you can speculate on what that reason is, hasn't been done. And the other thing is tightening up the rules on lobbying. So the UK has fantastically weak transparency laws. So I gave the example earlier of there was actually a meeting between Liz Truss and the IEA that got removed from the register, having originally been on the register, because she said, "Oh no, that was in a personal capacity." Like, the fact that can happen is crazy. The fact that she might be having loads of meetings in a personal capacity that we just don't know about as people who elect her and as taxpayers is just crazy. And the laws around transparency in this country are really bad. The freedom of information law, speaking as a journalist, is no longer really fit for purpose. The government has just found ways to make it a complete nonsense. It takes months and months and months to get back a document that is basically entirely redacted. And it takes a huge number of time and resources to then go and challenge that. And you can do it successfully, but it puts the onus on the people trying to get the information, which, again, in a democracy, shouldn't be the way. We elect these people. We have a right to know this stuff. That's why the Freedom of Information Act exists. And then also, like, our lobbying register. So you look at the EU Transparency Register, for example, there's some very basic information in there that's very, very easy to access. And they have quite tight rules on the reporting and who has to report and how they have to report. And you should have these great databases that at least give you the clues as to what is going on. And in this country, we just basically don't. Our lobbying laws are basically a bit of a joke. So again, tightening up that, all of that stuff would help. And those are kind of laws or rules or regulations that you could do, the government could do, or policymakers could do. And then, of course, there's the more informal ones. So, for example, when an organisation is brought on to question time, and they should be required to declare their funding. That doesn't seem unreasonable. It seems reasonable that if they're going to sit on a program that has huge political influence, that the public have a right to know who they may be talking on behalf of. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Now that's kind of hard to legislate for. That has to be something the media organisations themselves sort of decide to do, and I think the BBC in particular has to decide they do. And they did recently tweak their editorial guidance on think tanks because they know this is a problem, but they didn't go anywhere near far enough. It should be a requirement. If you want to be quoted, if you want to appear on mainstream media, particularly on the BBC, then you should be required to declare who your funders are. It's a democratic good. It's democratic right, really, to know that. And it's currently something that we're failing at.
Mm. I mean, like the you kind of mentioned that the UK government is kind of scandal proof at the minute, and that's they're Teflon. I don't understand how Matt Hancock is still in his post. I believe that man will be health secretary for life at this point because there is nothing that he could do worse, I think, and there apparently nothing he could do that would get him fired. Like, can you imagine? Like, sometimes I just like sit back and I'm like, you remember that Piers Morgan interview with Matt Hancock that was, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and he just gets shredded, just like completely shredded. Like, can you imagine Tony Blair like still having him in his cabinet? Can you imagine that? Like, I can't even fathom that would be a thing. Like by the time the interview was over, like Alistair Campbell would have cut off his like government phone. Like, he wouldn't just, like, he wouldn't even got a phone call. He would just finish the interview and be like, well, that's it. That's my political career done. Thanks. Bye. It was a good run. 10 years in the MP. Like, that, and yet now it's not even like a question. It's like, should you resign? He just goes, no. Or it's like, the secretary will not respond to questions about his resignation. And a source from inside Downing Street has said that Matt Hancock is not. Like, how did we get here?
I mean, but this is precisely the point, right? And again, this is where my answer about normalization comes in, right? So they've normalized this by just it happening again and again and again. And this is what you saw, frankly, with Trump. So Trump basically looked at the Constitution and looked at the US's ability to actually uphold the Constitution, legally uphold the Constitution, and went, all right, let's give it a go. Right? Let's test these boundaries. Let's push them as far as we can possibly go. And by virtue of just breaking it all the time, breaking rules all of the time, I don't think that's controversial to say. He very quickly found out that the capacity for holding people to account was much lower than the capacity to break rules, basically. And I think that's basically what we're finding in this country as well, is like our capacity to hold our leaders to account is far exceeded by their capacity to do wrong. And until we start to level that playing field, until equal resources are put into the side of trying to hold people to account, of organizations that media organizations that are trying to do corporate accountability work, or political organizations that are trying to hold leaders to account, until that playing field is leveled with those who are basically trying to push the boundaries for profit, basically, then this is what's going to happen. So that's kind of how we got here. It's just not a level playing field, and it just got normalized. And there's only so many articles DeSmog can write,
Yeah.
Basically, I'm not saying we're the answer to everything, but you know what I mean. Like, there's only so many articles we and others, like us, can write. There's only so many resources we have, and until that playing field is level, this is what's going to continue.
I mean, how much blame do you attribute this to, like, the mainstream press? Because right now it seems like it's more of a crime to walk into a shop with like no mask on than it is to hand out like millions and millions of pounds in government contracts with no bids to your friends or your neighbors. Like, it's like, honestly, because like I see more scolding of people who's like, yeah, I saw this person in Tesco's and they had their mask just under their nose. It's like, I hope they die. They deserve to have their whole family catch COVID and die. Like, some of the like vitriol I see, like, based on just the masks is really disturbing, given like the lack of outrage about like just handing away millions and millions of pounds in taxpayer money. Like, how much blame do you attribute the media to that? Because, like, obviously they're very good at like being selectively outraged, especially like our sort of mainstream tabloid press. Like, how much do you attribute that to them? Like, if they were saying we need to be mad, do you think we would be?
So I think the mainstream media bear responsibility for a lot of what happened. But in fairness, certainly the journalists I know, they do actually acknowledge that. There is a conversation within the media which is ongoing about how much responsibility the media currently bears for the current situation. I think that happened in a really big way in the US, and so DeSmog has a US sister site as well. It happened in a really big way in the US around the election of Trump. The media had this, internal debate about what its responsibility was after he got elected to them in the way they treated him. I think a similar conversation is happening, if I'm honest, behind the scenes around Brexit here. And it's not to say the media were inherently pro-Remain, but I think they understand that there were problems in the way they covered the issue. So I think there is this conversation going on, but that's also them acknowledging that they bear responsibility for that issue. But it's also the model of journalism. It's the capitalist model of journalism that we currently have, which is fundamentally broken. So if you're going to tie the value of journalism to the number of clicks an article gets, then you're in real trouble. And this isn't a radical thing to say. This isn't a particularly new thing to say. But if that's how this model is going to work, which is how it does now work, because broadly speaking, people expect to be able to consume, journalistic content for free, at least free at the point of access, then it inherently gets tied to advertising. If it's tied to advertising, then it gets tied to clicks. And if it's tied to clicks, then you're going to have really crap journalism, because it's, particularly during a pandemic, it's really tiring to read about the climate crisis all the time. You do want to read about cats, and that's fine. I don't blame the consumer for that. I don't blame the reader for that. That's entirely fine. But what I think there needs to be is a fundamental shift in terms of the kind of economic model and also the consumer model in understanding what good journalism is. And it's a democratic good. And if it's a democratic good, it's possibly actually a charitable good. And if it's a charitable good, then we have to have a really difficult and interesting conversation about how the media is funded. Because the way it's currently funded clearly leads to bad journalism. And bad journalism leads to a broken democracy.
Yeah, I mean, so would you say that this kind of like click-based advertiser model of journalism is unsustainable? Like, do you see it dying in the near future?
I don't see it done entirely, because there's always going to be a space in the market for that. But what I hope to see, and I think we are seeing to a certain extent, is reputable mainstream media organizations that have a long history of doing proud, good journalism, and that's across the political spectrum. There have been scoops across the board that have been really, really good. Realizing that is sort of worth investing in, even if it doesn't make you money. The problem is, how do you then fill that gap? And the way that we're currently doing it, so for example with the Times, is this gap being bought by a billionaire who has a vested interest in influencing political outcomes. That's not a good replacement. So,
what?
We have to find a way. I know, right? Yeah. Radical. But we've got to find a way where you're not substituting advertising revenue for billionaires who are vested interest in essentially hacking democracy. But we need to find a way to do this. We need to find a way to support good public interest media, basically. And reader donations, they happen, they're great. But again, if I'm entirely honest, I think the wider public don't quite understand quite how expensive doing good journalism is. Because when you're buying a newspaper for a couple of quid, back in the day when you used to buy newspapers, and it was full of some decent material, and I don't want to get too rose tinted about it, there's always been dross as well, let's not pretend. But when you're used to only paying £2 for that, you've got to remember that was also on top of all the advertising revenue they're getting, right? So that essentially small reader donation of when you bought that newspaper was only a tiny part of the business model even back then. To write a good article, to do a good investigative piece is fantastically expensive. It's fantastically resource intensive. And so while micro donations from readers are incredibly welcome, and I don't want to sound ungrateful to the people who give to us, it's brilliant. And of course, please do keep giving. It definitely does make a difference. It's nowhere near enough to essentially replace this system or change this system. It's only helping, basically.
Yeah. So then would you like to make like a final plug or pitch before we finish up here, Matt?
Well, I guess, I just started it, so I may as well finish it, which is, so DeSmog does take reader donations. We have a Patreon page. Please go to Patreon/DeSmogUK, DeSmog_UK, and you can make a reader donation if you like our work. As I say, it really does make a difference. We're charitably funded as well, which is why we can kind of do our bigger work, but our reader donations certainly do help. And just please visit the website, DeSmog.co.uk, read our work, share our work. Our work is only effective if people know about it. So please do read and spread the word.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. Check out DeSmogUK, check out my book. Go buy it, everyone. It's wonderful. I promise. Yeah. Thanks very much, Matt.
No worries at all. Always a pleasure to talk.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.